For the first time in 14 months, Nixon held a televised news conference and tried to turn the persistent questioning to his advantage.
At any time during the Watergate crisis, did you ever consider resigning? And would you consider resigning if you felt that your capacity to govern had been seriously weakened? And in that connection, how much do you think your capacity to govern has been weakened?
The answer to the first two questions is no. The answer to the third question is that it is true that as far as the capacity to govern is concerned, that to be under a constant barrage, 12 to 15 minutes a night on each of the three major networks for 4 months tends to raise some questions in the people's mind with regard to the president, and it may raise some questions with regard to the capacity to govern. The point that I make now is that we are proceeding as best we know how to get all those guilty brought to justice in Watergate. But now we must move on from Watergate to the business of the people. And the business of the people is continuing with the initiatives we began the first administration. Just a moment. We've had 30 minutes of this press conference. I have yet to have, for example, one question on the business of the people, which shows you how we're consumed with. I'm not criticizing the members.
But events overwhelmed the president's counteroffensive. In a scandal unrelated to Watergate, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, was under investigation for bribery, tax evasion, and extortion.
Gentlemen, I believe you've all received copies of the prepared statement that I read to the court.
On October 10th, Agnew pled no contest to tax evasion and resigned. Agnew's departure made Nixon more vulnerable. Unlike Agnew, his new vice president and potential successor was popular with Republicans and Democrats alike.
Our distinguished guests and my fellow Americans, I proudly present to you the man whose name I will submit to the Congress of the United States for confirmation as the Vice President of the United States, Congressman Gerald Ford of Michigan.
On Capitol Hill, Gerald Ford was already seen as a viable alternative to the president himself. That same day, the Court of Appeals ruled that Nixon must yield the tapes to Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. But Nixon saw the ruling as an opportunity for a showdown with Cox. He made an offer he thought would sound reasonable to the public, but that he was certain Cox would reject. Nixon would turn over summaries of the tapes, but not the tapes themselves, and he ordered Cox not to ask for any more material. As Nixon expected, Cox refused.
This is Jim Doyle from Archibald Cox's office. I have a long statement. Are you ready? In my judgment, the president is refusing to comply with the court decrees.
I think it is my duty to bring to the court's attention what seems to me to be non-compliance with the court's order.
Within hours, Nixon ordered Elliot Richardson to fire Archibald Cox. But Nixon had miscalculated. Richardson refused.
And he said, "Do you realize, Elliot, that Brezhnev may conclude that I'm losing control of my own administration?" But I said, "Mr. President, I am committed to the independence of the special prosecutor. For me to have acquiesced in his being fired would be a total betrayal of that commitment." He said, "I'm sorry that you choose to prefer your purely personal commitments to the national interest." Mustering all my self-control, I said in as level a voice as I could, "Mr. President, it would appear that we have a different assessment of the national interest."
The events that followed became known as the Saturday Night Massacre.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The president has fired the special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox, Because of the president's action, the Attorney General has resigned. Elliot Richardson has quit, saying he cannot carry out Mr. Nixon's instructions. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, has been fired. Ruckelshaus refused, in a moment of constitutional drama, to obey a presidential order to fire the special Watergate prosecutor. And half an hour after the special Watergate prosecutor had been fired, agents of the FBI, acting at the direction of the White House, sealed off the offices of the special prosecutor, the offices of the Attorney General, and the offices of the Deputy Attorney General.
6 FBI agents present, impeding our operations right now.
All of this adds up to a totally unprecedented situation, a grave and profound crisis in which the president has set himself against his own Attorney General and the Department of Justice. Nothing like this has ever happened before.
More than 50,000 telegrams poured in on Capitol Hill today. So many, Western Union was swamped. Most of them demanded impeaching Mr. Nixon.
These come from Republicans and businessmen and people, most of whom begin their statement by saying, I've supported the president, I've never believed in impeachment, but he's now gone too far, and we want the Congress to take strong action.
In my 3 district offices in the 1 Republican area, my phone calls were 100 to 1 in favor of pursuing the path of impeachment, which was rather shocking to me.
I was terribly surprised, which says something about that very weird thing that happens when you're in the middle of a cocoon of a crisis within a protected environment, and you have a great desire for things to happen as you want them to happen.
On Tuesday, Nixon learned that 21 resolutions calling for his impeachment had been introduced on Capitol Hill. Stunned by the ferocity of the public reaction, Nixon retreated. He appointed a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, and agreed to release the 9 subpoenaed tapes. But 2 tapes turned out to be missing. The White House said they never existed. A 3rd tape contained an 18.5-minute gap. The erased section was a conversation between the president and H.R. Haldeman 3 days after the break-in. The president's counsel, Fred Bizart, explained the gap to a skeptical press.
You now believe it could be accidental?
Yes.
How?
The White House claimed that the president's secretary, Rosemary Woods, had accidentally erased the tape while transcribing it.
Is that logical for that to happen accidentally? I mean, is that believable?
Yes.
Questions now arose about every aspect of the president's life. Campaign contributions, taxes, friendships, vacation homes. Everything seemed fair game. The president struggled to defend himself against assaults that came from all sides.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.